The Crows in Tragedy by Annie Haynes. Part 2. Chapter 8. Dismissing his taxi at the archway, Inspector Furnival made the best of his way to his office. Outside a man was standing. He touched his forehead respectfully. "Glad to see you, sir. The lady has just been to the door to say she can't wait more than 5 minutes longer." The inspector paused. "What is her name, Jones?" The man shook his head. "She wouldn't give one, sir. She said her business was with the detective in charge of the Betchcombe case, and with him alone. I was on tenterhooks all the time, sir, fearing that she would be gone before you came." The inspector nodded and went on. He turned the handle of his door quietly and entered the room as quickly and noiselessly as possible. If he had hoped to surprise his visitor, however, he found himself disappointed. She was standing immediately opposite the door with her back to the window. She did not wait for him to speak. "Are you in charge of the Betchcombe case?" she demanded, and he noticed that her voice was powerful and rather hard in tone. The inspector glanced keenly at her as he walked to the chair behind his office table. Standing thus with her back to the light, he could see little of his visitor's face, which was also concealed by the hat which was crushed down upon her forehead and overshadowed by an uncurled feather mount. But he could tell that she was fashionably gowned, that the furs she had thrown back from her shoulders were costly. He answered her question and asked another. "I am Inspector Furnival, and I am inquiring into the circumstances of Mr. Betchcombe's death. May I ask why you want to know?" His interlocutor took a few steps forward, clasping her hands nervously together. "You know that a white glove was found by Mr. Betchcombe's desk?" "Yes. It was my glove. I left it there." The inspector did not speak for a minute. He unlocked a drawer and took out an official-looking notebook. "Your name and address, madam?" "Is that necessary?" There was a quiver in the clear tones. "I have told you that I was there, that the glove is mine. Is not that enough?" "Scarcely, madam. But, waiving the subject of the name for a moment, why have you not spoken before?" "I didn't hear at first." She hesitated a moment, her foot tapping the floor impatiently. And now she was nearer to him, he could see that her makeup was extensive, that complexion and eyes owed much of their brilliancy to art, and that the red gold hair probably came off entirely. But it was a handsome face, though not that of a woman in her first youth. The features, though large, were well formed, and the big blue eyes would have been more beautiful without the black lines with which they were embellished. "I don't read the papers much, at least only the society news and about the theaters, never murders or horrors of that kind, and it was not until I heard some people talking about it, and they mentioned Mr. Betchcombe's name, that I knew what had happened. I did not realize at first that the murder had taken place on the very day which I had been to the office, and that it was my glove that had been found beside the desk. Even then I made up my mind not to speak out if I could help it. Mr. Betchcombe was alive and well when I saw him. I couldn't tell you anything about the murder. And I couldn't have my name mixed up in a murder trial, or let the papers or certain, people get to know what I had been doing at Mr. Betchcombe's office." "Then why have you come to us now?" "Because I thought if I didn't tell you, you would be sure to find out," was the candid reply. And if I came myself, I thought you might call me Madam X, or something like that. They do, you know, and then perhaps, people might never know." The inspector smiled. "I am afraid you are too well known and the illustrated papers are too ubiquitous for that, Mrs. Carntwack." She emitted a slight scream. "Oh. How did you know?" The inspector's smile became more apparent. "I was a great admirer of Miss Bella Lamond on the variety stage. I had the pleasure of assisting at her marriage with the American millionaire, Cyril B. Carntwack. That is to say, I was passing a fashionable church, saw a large waiting crowd, and was lucky enough to get in the first rank and obtain a good view of the beautiful bride. I could not help remembering a face like that, Mrs. Carntwack. And now I want you to forget that I am a detective, and just think that I am a friend who is anxious to help you, and tell me all the story of your visit to Mr. Betchcombe." He pushed forward a chair as he spoke. She looked from it to him undecidedly for a minute. Then, as if coming to a sudden resolution, she sat down and pulled the chair nearer to his desk. "You promise not to tell my husband what I am going to tell you?" "I promise," the inspector said reassuringly. "Now, first please, why did you come to Luke Betchcombe's office on the day of his death?" "Well, I dare say you know my husband is very rich." The inspector nodded. Cyril B. Carntwack's name and his millions were well known to the man in the street. When we were married he gave the most gorgeous jewels, Mrs. Carnthwack went on. And he made me an enormous allowance. Americans are always generous. Bless you, I thought I was going to have the time of my life. But I had never been rich. Even when I got on the stage and had a big salary, I was always in debt. I suppose I am extravagant by nature. Anyway, when I was married it seemed to me that I had an inexhaustible store to fall back upon. I spent money like water, with the result that after a time I had to go for more to my husband. He gave it to me, but I could see that he was astonished and displeased. Still, I could not change my nature. I gambled at cards, on the racecourse, on the stock exchange, and I staked high to give myself a new excitement. Sometimes I won, but more often I lost, and my husband helped me again and again. But more and more I could see I was disappointing him. At last he told me that he would pay no more for me. He hated and mistrusted all gambling, and I must make my huge allowance due. I couldn't give up gambling. It was in my blood. And just as I was in a horrible hole, the worst happened. A man who had been my lover years ago began to blackmail me. I gave him all I could, but nothing satisfied him. She stopped and passed a tiny lace-trimmed handkerchief over her lips. "Why did you not tell your husband?" the inspector inquired. "I guess Mr. Carnthwack would have settled him pretty soon." I daren't," she confessed. "And I have been an awful ass. This man, had letters. They were silly enough, goodness knows, and they might have been read to me more than they did, and my husband is jealous, terribly, wickedly jealous of my past. At last the man, said that if I would pay him a large and enormous sum, he would go abroad and I should never hear of him again. If I did not, he swore he would send the letters to my husband in such a fashion that the worst construction would be placed upon them. What was I to do? I hadn't any money. I dared not tell my husband. I made several attempts to pull off a grand coup, and only got worse in the mire. I made up my mind to sell my diamonds and substitute paste. A friend of mine had done so and apparently had never been suspected. But I couldn't take them to the shop myself. We were too well known in London. And when I was at my wits' end to know what to do with them, I happened to hear a woman saying how she had disposed of hers quite legitimately and openly through a solicitor, Mr. Luke Betchcombe. I thought perhaps he might do something for me, and I rang him up. "Well," the detective said interrogatively. His face was as expressionless as ever, but there was a veiled eagerness in his deep-set eyes as they watched Mrs. Carnthwack's every movement. "I told him what I wanted, and he said it would be necessary to have them valued. We talked it over and made an appointment for 2 days later, the very day he was murdered. I was to take them to him myself. And he told me to go down the passage to his private door so that none of his clients should see me, because I explained that it must be kept a real dead secret." "What time was your appointment for?" the inspector asked. 12:15, Mrs. Carnthwack answered. "But I was late. It must have been quite 12:30 when I got there. He looked at the diamonds and said that they were very fine and he would have them valued at once and get them disposed of for me if I approved of the price. He was to ring me up at 12 o'clock the next day. But of course he didn't, and I couldn't think what had happened, until I saw this dreadful thing in the papers. Oh, you will keep my name out of it, won't you?" She broke off and looked appealingly at the inspector. He did not answer. For once in his long experience he was thoroughly taken aback. The woman had told her story calmly and convincingly enough, and as the inspector looked at her he wondered if she had no idea of the horrible danger in which she stood. "I will do my best for you in every way," he said at last. "But you must first answer all my questions straightforwardly. You have at least done the right thing in coming to us now, though it might have been better if you had come earlier. Now first will you tell me exactly what time you reached Mr. Betchcombe's office?" "Well, as I say, I ought to have been there at 12:15, but I dare say it was 12:30, or it might have been 1:45. The inspector kept his keen eyes upon her face. Not one change in her expression could escape him. "Mrs. Carnthwack, do you know that the doctors have stated that Mr. Betchcombe died about 12 o'clock, sooner rather than later?" 12 o'clock. Her face turned almost livid in spite of its makeup, but her blue eyes met the inspector steadily. "It's no use, Inspector. I suppose doctors make mistakes like other folks sometimes. Luke Betchcombe was alive, very much alive, when I went in about 12:30. The inspector did not argue the question, but his eyes did not relax their watchful gaze for 1 second as he went on. "How did Mr. Betchcombe seem when you saw him? Did you notice anything peculiar about his manner?" Well, I had never seen him before, so I couldn't notice any difference. He just seemed an ordinary, pleasant sort of man. He admired my diamonds very much and said we ought to get a high price for them. He was to have had them valued the next day. Now I am in pressing need of money and I want to have them valued myself if you will give them back to me. For once Inspector Furnival was shaken out of his usual passivity. Do you mean that you left the diamonds there? Well, of course. Haven't I been telling you so all this time? Mrs. Carnthwack said impatiently. Mr. Betchcombe gave me a receipt for them, and locked them up in his safe, like that one. She pointed to the wall where a large cupboard was built into it. The executors will give them to me, won't they? The inspector went over and stood near the door. Mrs. Carnthwack, when the door of the safe was opened in the presence of Mr. Betchcombe's executors and of the police, there were no diamonds there. What? You cannot mean that my diamonds are lost. Mrs. Carnthwack started to her feet. Mr. Betchcombe put them in the safe himself, I tell you. That was not a safe. It is just an ordinary cupboard in which papers and documents of no particular importance were kept. And when the safe was opened there was no sign of diamonds there, the inspector said positively. It may be possible that Mr. Betchcombe moved them before otherwise. Otherwise what? She demanded. Heavens, man, speak out. My diamonds are worth thousands of pounds. Otherwise what? Otherwise they may have provided a motive for the crime, the inspector said slowly. But no, that is impossible, if you saw him lock them up. Of course I did, you may bet I watched that. Mrs. Carnthwack calmed down a little. Besides, I have got the receipt. That makes him or his executors liable for the diamonds, doesn't it? Have you the receipt here? The inspector asked quickly. Of course. I thought it might be wanted to get back my diamonds. The fact that your firm might deny having them never entered my head. She opened the vanity bag which hung at her side and took out a piece of paper crushed with much folding. There. You can't get away from that. The inspector read it. Mrs. Carnthwack has entrusted her diamonds to me for valuation, and I have deposited them in my safe. Signed, Luke Francis Betchcombe, he read. The paper on which it was written was Luke Betchcombe's. There was no doubt of that. The inspector had seen its counterpart in Mr. Betchcombe's private room. But his face altered curiously as he looked at it. Certainly, if this receipt was given you by Mr. Betchcombe, the estate is liable for the value of the diamonds, he finished up. Well, Mr. Betchcombe gave it me safe enough, Mrs. Carnthwack declared. I put it in this same little bag and went off, little thinking what was going to happen. It struck 1 as I came out. 1 o'clock. The inspector was looking puzzled. If Mrs. Carnthwack's story was true, it was in direct contradiction to the doctor's. Did you meet anyone on the stairs? Mrs. Carnthwack looked undecided. I don't remember. Yes, I think I did, some young man or another. I didn't notice him much. And you didn't notice anything peculiar in Mr. Betchcombe's manner? Nothing much, Mrs. Carnthwack said, holding out her hand for the receipt. I'll have that back, please. You bet I don't part with it till I have got my diamonds back. The only thing I thought was that Mr. Betchcombe seemed in rather a hurry, sort of wanted me to quit. The inspector felt inclined to smile. Half an hour in the busiest time of the day seemed a fairly liberal allowance even for a millionaire's wife. Now, can you tell me how many people know that you were bringing the diamonds to Mr. Betchcombe? Not one. What do you take me for? A first-class idiot? Mrs. Carnthwack demanded indignantly. Nobody knew that I had the diamonds at all, not even my maid. I kept them in a little safe in my bedroom, one my husband had specially made for me. Great Scott, I was a bit too anxious to keep the whole business quiet to go talking about it. Not even to the friend that told you that Mr. Betchcombe had helped her out of a similar difficulty? No, not a word. I didn't think of asking Mr. Betchcombe while she was with me, and the next day she went off to Cannes and I haven't seen her since. The receipt, please. The inspector did not relax his hold. You will understand that this is a most valuable piece of evidence, madam. You will have to entrust it to me. I will of course give you a written acknowledgement that I have it. The color flashed into Mrs. Carnthwack's face. Do you mean that you will not let me have it back? I am afraid I cannot, madam. She sprang forward with outstretched hands, just missed it by half an inch. The inspector quietly put it in his notebook and, snapping the elastic round it, returned it to his pocket. "You may rely upon me to do my best for you, madam. I shall make every possible search for the diamonds and will communicate with the executors, who will of course recognize their responsibility if the jewels are not found. And now will you let me give you one piece of advice?" "I don't know. I guess I am not a good person to give advice to." Evidently Mrs. Carnthwack was not to be placated. Her eyes flashed, and one foot beat an impatient tattoo on the floor. The inspector was unruffled. "Nevertheless, I think I will venture upon it. Tell your husband yourself what has happened. He will help you more efficiently than anyone else in the whole world can. And Mr. Carnthwack's advice is worth having." Chapter 9. "Good morning, Miss Hoyle." Inspector Furnival rose and placed a chair for the girl, scrutinizing her pale face keenly as he did so. Cecily sat down. "You sent for me," she said nervously. The inspector took the chair at the top of the table that had been Luke Betchcomb's favorite seat. His interview with Cecily Hoyle was taking place by special arrangement in the library of the murdered man's private house, where, by special desire of Mrs. Betchcombe, Cecily was now installed as secretary to her late employer's widow. The canny inspector had taken care to place the girl's chair so that the light from the near window fell full upon her face. As he drew his papers towards him and opened a capacious notebook, he was thinking how white and worn the girl was looking, and there was a frightened glance in her brown eyes as she sat down that did not escape him. The door opened to admit John Stedman. After a slight bow to Cecily, he sat down at the inspector's right. "Yes," the inspector said, glancing across at Cecily, "I want to ask you a few questions, Miss Hoyle. It may make matters easier for you at the adjourned inquest if you answer them now." "I will do my best," Cecily said, looking at him with big, alarmed eyes. "But really, I have told you everything I know." John Stedman watched her from his lowered eyes. She would be a good witness with the jury, he thought, this slim, pale girl, with her great appealing eyes and her pathetic, trembling lips. "A few curious sidelights have arisen in connection with Mr. Betchcomb's death," the inspector pursued. "And I think you may be able to help me more than you realize. First, you recognize this, of course." He took from its envelope of tissue paper the picture postcard he had found in Amos Thompson's room in Brooklyn Terrace and handed it to her. Cecily gazed at it in growing amazement. It looks like me." "It is me, I believe," she said ungrammatically. "But how in the world did you get it?" "I found it," the inspector said slowly, watching every change in her mobile face as he spoke, "in Amos Thompson's room in Brooklyn Terrace." Cecily stared at him. "Impossible. You couldn't have. Why should Mr. Thompson have my photograph? And where was this taken, anyway?" "That is what I am hoping you may tell us." "But I can't. I don't know," Cecily said, still gazing in a species of stupefaction at her presentment. It is a snapshot, of course, but I never saw it before, I never knew when it was taken." "You did not give it to Amos Thompson, then?" the inspector questioned. "Good heavens, no. I knew nothing about Mr. Thompson. I have just seen him at a distance in the office. But I have never spoken to him in my life. I should not have known him had I met him in the street." "You can give no explanation of his treasuring your photograph, then?" Cecily shook her head. "I can't indeed. I should have thought it a most unlikely thing to happen. I cannot bring myself to believe that it did. This thing," flicking the card with her forefinger, "must have got into his room by accident." The inspector permitted himself a slight smile. "I really do not think so." Cecily shrugged her shoulders. "Well, I give it up. Unless," an accent of fear creeping into her voice, "he wanted to implicate me, to make you think that I had been helping him to rob Mr. Betchcombe. In that case he would surely have thought of some rather more sure plan than leaving your photograph about in his room," said the inspector. "You do not think it likely that seeing you so much in the office, he has taken a fancy to you, fallen in love with you in fact, as people say?" "I do not, indeed," Cecily said impatiently. "As I tell you, I know nothing of Mr. Thompson, and he did not see much of me in the office. I never went in to Mr. Betchcomb's room through the clerk's office. I never had occasion to go there at all. My business concerned Mr. Betchcombe, and Mr. Betchcombe only, and by his wish I always went to him by the private door." "I see." The inspector studied the photograph in silence. "You know where this was taken?" he said at last. Cecily looked at it again. "It looks," I believe I am sitting in my favorite seat in the field of rest. I suppose I must have been snapshot without my knowing it, by some amateur probably. Mr. Thompson, the inspector suggested. I do not know. Cecily tilted her chin scornfully. It was a mean thing to do anyway. The inspector wrapped the photograph in its paper. No use bothering about that anymore, he said somewhat contradictorily, putting it away carefully in his pocket as he did so. Now, Miss Hoyle, once more, you adhere to your statement that you heard someone moving about in Mr. Betchcomb's room when you passed the door on your return from lunch, that return being some little time after 1 o'clock. 1:30, I dare say, Cecily corrected. As I came down the passage, I heard the door into Mr. Betchcomb's room close rather softly, as I have heard Mr. Betchcombe close it heaps of times. Then just as I passed, I heard someone move inside the room distinctly. It was a sound like a chair being moved and catching against something hard, table leg or something of that sort. And you are aware that the doctors say that Mr. Betchcomb's death must have occurred about 12 o'clock? I have heard so. You told me so, Cecily murmured, then gathering up her courage. But doctors make mistakes very often. Scarcely over a thing of this kind, the inspector remarked. I suppose you realize the inference that will be drawn from your testimony, he went on. A little frown came between Cecily's straight eyebrows. Inference? No, I don't, she said bluntly. If Mr. Betchcombe died at 12 o'clock, and you heard someone moving about when you came back about 1:30 o'clock, the inspector said very slowly, giving due weight to each word, the inference is that the person you heard moving about when you came back was the murderer. Cecily shivered as she stared at him. Oh no, surely it could not have been. I do not believe it could. The inspector made no rejoinder. He glanced at his notebook again. Most probably you will be among the first witnesses called at the adjourned inquest on Friday, Miss Hoyle. I think that is all for today. Your name and address, please. Cecily Frances Hoyle, Hobart Residence, Windover Square. The detective wrote it down. I think that is only a temporary address, though, you said, Miss Hoyle. Will you let me have your permanent one, please? Cecily hesitated in obvious confusion. That is my only address, the only one I have at present. I came to Mr. Betchcombe straight from school. The inspector scratched the side of his nose with his pencil. That is rather awkward. It will be necessary that we should be in touch with you for some time, and you might leave Hobart Residence at any moment. Then I could let you know, Cecily suggested. That would not quite do, the inspector said mildly. No. Just give me some address from which letters could be forwarded to you. Some relatives, perhaps. I don't know any of my relatives yet, Cecily faltered, a streak of red coming in her pale cheeks. But Miss Cochrane, Morley House, Beesford, Meadshire, would always forward letters. The inspector wrote the address down without further comment. Cecily got up. If that is all, I think Mrs. Betchcombe wants me, Inspector. Yes, thank you. The inspector and Mr. Stedman rose too. John Stedman moved to the door. I must introduce myself, Miss Hoyle, he said courteously. I am the late Mr. Betchcomb's cousin, and as your post with Mrs. Betchcombe is of course only temporary, it has struck me that you might possibly be looking out for another engagement. Now, a friend of mine is in urgent need of a secretary, and we thought you might like the post. The red streak in Cecily's cheeks deepened to crimson. I don't mean to do anything else at present, thank you. John Stedman looked disappointed. Oh well. Then there is no more to be said. Should you change your mind, perhaps you will let us know, he said politely. When he had closed the door behind Cecily, he looked across at the inspector. Well, you were right. I was pretty sure of my ground, returned the inspector. What do you think of young Mr. Collier's choice, Mr. Stedman? Well, she looks a nice girl enough, the barrister returned somewhat dubiously. It is easier to look nice than to be nice nowadays, the inspector returned enigmatically. What do you make of this, Mr. Stedman? Throwing a torn telegram form on the table. And this, placing several odd pieces of writing paper beside it. The barrister bent over them. The used telegraph form had been torn across and crumpled, but as the inspector smoothed it out, the writing was perfectly legible. Do not mention home address. Father. John Stedman drew in his lips. Handed in at Edgware Road Post Office at 12.30, March 4th, he said. Well. He turned to the scraps of paper. The inspector leaned forward and pieced them together. The whole made part of a letter. "We'll see you as soon as possible. In the meantime, be very careful. A chance word of yours may do untold harm. Say as little as possible, all will be explained later. Further instructions will reach you soon." Then came a piece that was torn away, and it ended in the corner, 5 o'clock, physical energy. John Stedman's face was very stern as he looked up. "It is obvious the girl knows something. How did you get these scraps of paper, Inspector?" "One of our most trustworthy women agents has been doing casual work in Hobart residence," said Inspector Furnival with a quiet smile. "These were found in Miss Cecily Hoyle's room there, in the waste paper basket. Have you taken any steps in the matter?" "Not yet. Of course we have had physical energy, the statue in Kensington Gardens, you know, watched since yesterday morning, but so far there has been no sign of Miss Cecily Hoyle, or of anyone who could be identified as the writer of that letter." "Have you any idea who that is likely to be?" "Well, ideas are not much use, are they, sir? It is not young Mr. Collier's writing, so much is certain, I think." Was the inspector's reply evasive? Used to weighing evidence, John Stedman decided that it was. He made no comment, however, but bent his brows over the paper once more. "Of course the temporary help has been chatting with the regular staff at Hobart residence," the inspector pursued. "But there is little enough to be learned of Miss Hoyle there. Hobart residence is a sort of hostel, you know, sir. All the inmates are supposed to be ladies in some sort of a job. They have a bedroom varying in price according to its position, and there is a general dining room in which meals are served at a very reasonable price. Miss Hoyle usually took her breakfast and dinner there and was very seldom absent from either meal. She was looked upon as a very quiet, well-conducted girl, but she made no friends, and nothing was known of her private life. It was impossible to get at her home address there. Then I rang up Miss Watson, her old schoolmistress, but found that Cecily Hoyle's father had always paid her school bills in advance. He is an artist and has never given any settled address. Sometimes he took his daughter away in the vacation. If he did not, Miss Watson was asked to arrange a seaside or country holiday for her. Miss Watson only knew the Hobart residence address." "Extraordinary. I should have thought Cecily Hoyle one of the last girls about whom there would be any mystery," was the barrister's comment. "Well, having drawn both those coverts blank, yesterday I made an exhaustive search of her room at Mr. Betchcomb's offices," the inspector proceeded. "For a long time I thought I was going to have no better luck there. There were no letters, no private papers of any kind. Then just at the last I had a bit of luck. Right down at the bottom of the drawer in Miss Hoyle's desk I found a timetable. I ran through it, not expecting to discover anything there, when I noticed that one leaf was turned down. It was a London and South Western Railway guide, I may mention, and it was one of the B pages that was turned down. I ran down it and saw in a minute that someone had been doing so with a lead pencil. There were several marks down the page, and one name, that of Burford in the New Forest, was underlined. Burford. John Stedman repeated reflectively. "Why, of course I have been there for golf. There are some very decent links. My friend, Captain Horsham, rented a house in the neighborhood, and I have been over the course with him." "Many burglaries down there," the inspector said abruptly. The barrister emitted a short laugh. "None that I ever heard of. Why, do you suspect Miss Hoyle?" "I don't suspect anybody," the inspector returned. "It isn't my place to, you know, sir. But I am going down to Burford tomorrow morning. Do you feel inclined to come with me?" "I don't mind if I do," said the barrister cheerfully. "I can always do with a day in the country. We will drive down in the car, and I might take my clubs." Chapter 10. Just 1 o'clock. We have come down in very decent time. Tidy old bus, isn't it? John Stedman replaced his watch and looked round with interest as his car slowed down before the Royal Arms at Burford. Rather a dilapidated Royal Arms to judge by the signboard swaying in the breeze, but quite a picturesque-looking village inn for all that. There was no station within 5 miles of Burford, which so far had preserved it from trippers. Of late, however, 2 or 3 of the ubiquitous char-a-bancs had strayed through the village, and there appeared every prospect of its being eventually opened up. This, with other scraps of information, was imparted by the garrulous landlord to Mr. Stedman and his companion, Inspector Furnival. But though he talked much of the village and its inhabitants, the inspector did not catch the name for which he was listening. At last he spoke. "I used to know a man named Hoyle who lived somewhere in this part. I wonder if he is still here." "Oh, I should think that would be Mr. Hoyle of Rose Cottage," the landlord said at once. "A very nice gentleman. He has been here some years. He is an artist, as no doubt you know, sir. And I have heard that some of his paintings have been exhibited in London in the Royal Academy. Oh, we are very proud of Mr. Hoyle down here. He is a good deal away on his sketching expeditions, though, isn't he?" the inspector ventured. "Well, naturally he is," the landlord agreed. "Sometimes he's away weeks at a time. But he is generally here on a Sunday to take the collection in church. He is a sidesman and takes a great interest in parish matters. I did hear that he was far away the biggest subscriber to the new parish hall that our vicar is having built. Oh, a very nice gentleman is Mr. Hoyle. Mrs. Y, his housekeeper, can't say so often enough." "I think that must be the man I used to know," said the inspector mendaciously. "I think we must drive up and pay him a visit, Mr. Stedman. It isn't far, you said, I think, landlord." "Get there in 10 minutes in the car, sir. Rose Cottage, straight up by the church. You can't miss it. But there, I doubt if you will find Mr. Hoyle at home. I was at church on Sunday morning, and I noticed he wasn't. He usually is when he is at home. I can't always say the same myself." And the landlord shook his fat sides at his own pleasantry. "Well, I think we will try anyway," the inspector concluded. "Perhaps Miss Hoyle may be at home if he isn't." Miss Hoyle. The landlord looked puzzled for a moment, then his face cleared. "Oh, Mr. Hoyle's daughter you mean, sir? No. She is away at school, though Mr. Hoyle did say she would be coming home for keeps this year. Anyhow, I shall leave a message, and Mr. Hoyle will know I have looked him up," said the inspector pleasantly. "I expect he would think me a good deal altered, for we haven't met for something like 12 years, and we none of us grow younger, you know, landlord." "We don't, sir, that's a fact. Not but what Mr. Hoyle is as little changed as anybody I know. Just the same pleasant-looking gentleman he is as he was the first time I saw him. A nice cheerful gentleman is Mr. Hoyle, always ready with his joke." The inspector nodded. "Oh, just the same, I see. Well, we will be off. As likely as not we shall come in here on our way back. Anyhow, I shall not forget your Stilton in a hurry, landlord. I haven't had a cut from a cheese like that since I was a boy in Leicestershire. By the way, what was that I heard of a burglary down this way last week?" The landlord scratched his head. "It is funny you should ask that, sir. I haven't heard of anything lately. I was talking to a couple of gents this morning about a robbery there was about this time a year ago, a couple of robberies I might say. Squire Morpeth over at the park, and Sir John Lington at Lillinghurst were both broken into and hundreds of pounds worth of goods, silver and what not, taken. Nobody was ever brought to account for it either, though there were big rewards offered. Dear. One doesn't expect to hear of such things in a quiet little place like Burford," the inspector observed contradictorily. "Well, so long, landlord. See you again later." It did not take long, following the landlord's instruction, to run the car up to Rose Cottage, but just as they were nearing it John Stedman looked at his companion. "I think you're running off on a side track, you know, Inspector." "I'm sure I am," the other returned cheerfully. "But when the straight track takes you nowhere, one is inclined to make a little excursion down a side path, right or wrong." Rose Cottage looked quite an ideal dwelling for an artist. It was a black and white timbered cottage standing back from the road, its garden for the most part surrounded by a high hedge. Over the walls creepers were running riot. Later on there would be a wealth of color, but today only the Pyrus japonica was putting forth adventurous rosy blossoms. A wicket gate gave access to the gravelled path running up to the rustic porch between borders gay with crocuses, purple and white and gold. "Evidently cars are not expected here," John Stedman remarked as he and the inspector alighted and walked up to the front door. There was apparently no bell, but there was a shining brass knocker. Inspector Furnival applied himself to it with great energy. The door was opened by a pleasant-looking woman, who was hastily donning a white apron. "Mr. Hoyle?" the inspector queried. "Not at home," the woman said at once. The inspector hesitated. "Can you tell me when he will be at home?" The woman shook her head. "I cannot indeed. He is away on a sketching expedition, and one never knows when he will be back. It may be a week or a month or longer." "Oh dear." The inspector looked at Mr. Stedman. "This is most unfortunate. I was particularly anxious to see him today. However, I suppose I must write." I wonder if you would let me just scribble a line here? I should esteem it a great favor if you would." For a moment the woman looked doubtful, then after a keen glance at the two men she led the way to a sitting room that apparently ran from back to front of the house. She indicated a writing table. "You will find pens and ink there, sir." The inspector sat down. "A very pretty room this," he began conversationally. "I wonder if I am right in thinking that you are Mrs. Hoyle?" "Oh dear no, sir." The woman laughed. "I am only Mr. Hoyle's housekeeper. I have lived with him ever since he came to Burford. And that must be a dozen years or more ago now. And I haven't seen him a dozen times, I should say," the inspector went on. "Dear, dear, how time flies. His daughter must be grown up, I suppose," he went on, examining the pens before him with meticulous care. "Miss Cecily? Oh yes, a fine-looking young lady too. She will be here for good very soon." Meanwhile John Stedman, standing near the door, was glancing appraisingly round the room. It was essentially a man's room. The chairs, square solid table, sideboard and writing table were all of oak, very strong. The few easy chairs were leather-covered and capacious. There was nothing unnecessary in the room. Near the French window looking onto the garden at the back of the house there stood an easel with an untidy pile of sketches piled one on top of the other upon it. A table close at hand held more sketches, tubes of paint, a palette and various paintbrushes. Stedman walked across and took one of the watercolors from the easel. "I like this," he said, holding it from him at arm's length. "It is a charming little view of one of the forest glades near here, taken at sunset. Is there any possibility of this being for sale?" "Well, I don't rightly know, sir," the housekeeper said, coming over to him. "Mr. Hoyle do sell some of his pictures, I know. But it is always in London. I have never known him do it down here." John Stedman smiled. "Well, I shouldn't think there would be many customers down here. But I could do with a couple. This one, and another to make a pair with it." "Well, sir, perhaps you will write to Mr. Hoyle about it," the housekeeper suggested. "I couldn't say anything about it." "Of course not," the barrister assented. He looked very closely at the picture for a minute, and then put it back on the easel. "Well, I must leave it at that, and hope to persuade Mr. Hoyle to part with it when he comes back." As he spoke there came a loud knock at the door. He looked at the housekeeper. "It's all right, sir," she said composedly. "It is only the baker's man for orders, and my niece will go to the door. She always comes up twice a week to give me a hand with the work. Me not being so young as I might be." "We none of us are, ma'am," the inspector said with a chuckle as he sealed his letter and placed it in a conspicuous place on the writing table. "Not that you have much to complain about," he added gallantly as he rose. The housekeeper smiled complacently as she saw them off to the little garden. The inspector was in an expansive mood and stopped to admire the crocuses as they passed. "Well," Mr. Stedman said as they seated themselves in the car before starting. The inspector waited until they had started before he replied, then he said quietly, "Well, Mr. Stedman, sir?" "Well," the barrister echoed. "I hope you have found what you expected, Inspector." "I hardly know what I did expect," the inspector said candidly. "Except that, if matters are as I suspect, Hoyle is certainly not the man to give himself away." The barrister coughed. "And yet I noticed one small thing that may help you, Inspector. You saw that watercolor sketch." "The one you are going to buy," the inspector assented with a grin. I should like to have had a good look round at those drawings. But that blessed housekeeper wasn't giving us any chances." "Not that she knew of," John Stedman said quietly. "Did you notice the big Christopher Hoyle in the left-hand corner of the painting, Inspector?" "I saw it," said the inspector, "but it didn't tell me much." "No. That alone did not," John Stedman went on. "But I looked at that, and I looked at several of the others. And I am as sure as I can be without subjecting them to a test, that in each case the big flourishing Christopher Hoyle has been scrawled with a paintbrush on the top of another signature. One, moreover, that from the little I could see of it bore no sort of resemblance to Christopher Hoyle. What do you make of that, Inspector?" "Is Mr. Christopher Hoyle a man with two names?" the inspector questioned. "Or has he some reason to wish to appear to be an artist in simple Burford society, when in reality he is nothing of the kind?" "The latter, I imagine," John Stedman said after a pause. "Because, I don't know whether you know anything of painting, Inspector?" "Bless you, not a thing," the inspector said energetically. "If I have to do with a picture case, I have to call in experts. But you mean? Judging from the 3 or 4 sketches I was able to examine, I should say that none of them, no 2 of them were done by the same hand. There is as much difference in painting as in handwriting, you know, Inspector. I see. The detective sat silent for a minute, his eyes scanning the flying landscape. Well, it is pretty much what I expected to hear, he said at last. It strengthens my suspicions so far. I can't understand your suspicions, John Stedman said impatiently. This man Hoyle is a bit of a humbug, evidently, but what connection can there be between him and Luke Betchcomb's murder? His daughter, the inspector suggested without looking round. The barrister shrugged his shoulders. That girl is no murderess. No, agreed the inspector. But she is helping the guilty to escape. John Stedman raised his eyebrows. Who is the guilty? For answer, Inspector Furnival's keen, ferret eyes looked back at him, focused themselves on the barrister's face as though they would wring some truth from it. But John Stedman's face would never give him away. In his day, he had been one of the keenest cross-examiners at the bar. His eyes had never been more blandly expressionless than now as they met the inspector's inquiringly. Defeated, the detective sank back in his corner of the car with a deep breath, whether of relief or disappointment John Stedman could not tell. They were just entering Burford again. Before the car stopped, the inspector said quietly, "Don't you know, sir?" "I do not," said John Stedman, looking him squarely in the face. "Don't you guess?" "Guessing," said the barrister sententiously, "is a most unprofitable employment. One I never indulge in." "Ah well," said the inspector as the car stopped before the door of the inn. "I don't know, sir. And you don't guess. We will leave it at that. Well, landlord," as that worthy came to the door rubbing his hands, "we are back upon your hands for tea." Mr. Hoyle was out. Chapter 11. Anthony Collier got out of his bus at Lancaster Gate Tube. He looked round, but there was no sign of the figure he was hoping to see. He crossed the road and entered Kensington Gardens, stopping at the gate to buy some chocolates of the kind that Cecily particularly affected. Near the little sweet stall, a small ragged figure was skulking. In his preoccupation, Anthony did not even see him. Inside the gardens, he turned into a sheltered walk on the right, flanked on either side by clumps of evergreens. There was a touch of chill in the wind, but the sun was shining brightly, and through the short grass the daffodils were already adventurously poking their gay yellow heads. The urchin who had been lurking by the palings followed slowly. He got over on the grass in a leisurely fashion and ensconced himself out of sight in the shadow of the evergreens. Anthony had time to glance at his watch more than once, and even to grow a little impatient before Cecily appeared. Then one glance was enough to show him that there was something amiss with the girl. There were big blue half-circles beneath her eyes, and the eyes themselves were dim and sunken. All her pretty coloring looked blurred as she gave her hand to Anthony, and he saw that it was trembling and felt that it was cold even through her glove. He held it in both of his and chafed it. "You are cold, dear," he said solicitously. "Are your furs warm enough? The wind is treacherous today." "Oh, I don't know. Yes, of course I am warm enough. I mean, it does not matter," Cecily said incoherently. I wrote to you, you know, because I wanted to see you." Tony looked round. No one was in sight. He drew her to a seat beside the path, knowing nothing of the unseen watcher hidden in the rhododendrons. "I hoped you did. I always want to see you, Cecily," he said simply. Cecily shivered away from him. You must not." Anthony stared at her. "Must not what?" he said blankly. "Want to see you, do you mean?" Cecily nodded. "Oh, but it is no use telling me not to do that," Anthony said quaintly. "I shall want to see you every day as long as I live." "You will not be able to," Cecily said desperately. "Because now, today, I am going right out of your life. You will never see me again." "Oh." For a time Anthony said no more. His clasp of her hand relaxed. Very quietly he returned to her the possession of it. "I see," he said at last. "You are giving me the chuck, are you not?" The girl looked at him with frightened, miserable eyes. "Tony, I can't help it." "Naturally you can't," Tony assented moodily. "You couldn't be expected to. I never was anything but a wretched match at the best of times, even with the money Uncle Luke left me. But now that every damned rag of a paper in the country is saying out as plainly as they dare that I am a murderer, it settles the matter, of course." Cecily interrupted him with a little cry. "Tony, you know it isn't that." A gleam of hope brightened Anthony Collier's eyes. Not that? Is it just that you are sick of me then? Heaven knows I wouldn't blame you for that. I was always a dull sort of chap. But I love you, Cecily. The girl's big tragic eyes looked at his bent head with a sudden wave of tenderness in their brown depths. And I love you, Tony, she said beneath her breath. But that does not matter. Doesn't it? A sudden fire leaped into Anthony's deep-set eyes. Why, that is just the one thing that matters. The only thing that does matter. If you love me, I shall never go out of your life, Cecily. Oh yes, you will, the girl said, putting his warm, outstretched hand back determinedly. And it doesn't matter that we love one another, not one bit. Because I am not going to marry anyone. Of course you are, said Anthony, staring at her. You are going to marry me. Do you really think I am going to let you back out of it now? You can't help yourself, Cecily said, still with that miserable note of finality in her voice. It is no use, Tony. You have just got to forget me. Forget you? Anthony said scornfully. That is so likely, isn't it? Now, dear, what is this bogey that you have conjured up that is going to separate us? You say it has nothing to do with me. No. Of course it hasn't. And you haven't fallen in love with anyone else? Don't be silly, Tony. There was a momentary irritation in the clear tones. But something in the accent, even in the homely words themselves, roused fresh hopes in Anthony's heart. Then it is something someone else has said, he hazarded, or done. For a moment Cecily did not answer. She pressed her lips very closely together. At last she said slowly, That is all that I can tell you, Tony. I just wanted to say that, and goodbye. Goodbye. Tony repeated scoffingly. Nonsense, dear. You say that this mysterious something has nothing to do with you or with me personally. And for the rest of the world, what does it matter? Nothing counts but just you and me, sweetheart. Oh, but it does. Cecily contradicted firmly. We can't think only of ourselves. It is no use, Tony. My mind is made up. Then I am going to unmake it, Tony said with equal decision. And if you won't tell me what you fancy is going to separate us, I am going to find out for myself. Then for the first time Cecily's self-possession really deserted her. No. You must not, she cried feverishly. Tony, you must not. You do not know what terrible harm you might do if you did. Promise me you will not. She caught at his arm with trembling hands, as though to stop his threatened action by actual physical force. If ever fear had looked out of human eyes, stark, tragic fear, Anthony saw it then as he met her terrified gaze. Some shadow of it communicated itself to him. He felt suddenly cold, his face turned a sickly gray beneath its tan. In that moment he realized fully that he was up against some very real and tangible obstacle that stood definitely between Cecily and himself. Cecily, he said hoarsely. Cecily. The girl looked at him a moment, her lips twitching, then, as if coming to some sudden resolution, she bent forward and whispered a few words in his ear. As he heard them he started back. What do you say, Cecily? That you know, but you are mad. Hush! The girl looked round fearfully. No, I am not mad, Anthony, she said beneath her breath. God knows I often wish I were. Then Anthony looked at her. Cecily! I can't believe it. You didn't. Did you never suspect that? She questioned beneath her breath. Never. Before heaven, never. How should I? It is inconceivable. But the horrible danger, his eyes voiced the dread he dared not put into words, and with a stifled cry the girl turned from him. Tony took off his hat and wiped away the sweat that was standing in great drops on his forehead. It isn't possible. Cecily, he murmured hoarsely. It is a lie. I wish it was, the girl said beneath her breath. Oh, Tony, I wish it was all a dream, a dreadful, horrible dream. Last night I woke and thought it was, and then I remembered. Oh, Tony. She shivered from head to foot. I wish I were dead, oh, I wish I were dead. Anthony mopped his forehead again. In God's name, what are we to do? Cecily's mouth twisted in something like a wry smile. It is not we, Tony. It never will be we again. And I cannot tell what I shall do yet. I must stay at the residence of course until the police. She stopped, her throat working. Until I am free to go away, she finished forlornly. Then God knows what will become of me. I expect I shall live out of England if I can. Yes, said Anthony slowly. Yes. But that will not be forever. We are both young, and we can wait. And someday I will come and fetch you home again. No. The horror in the girl's eyes deepened. Won't you understand, Tony? I shall never come back. I shall never be safe. From today I shall be dead to you. But wait, Tony. Sometimes I do not think that I shall get away, that I shall escape. For everywhere they follow me. Always I know that I am being watched. They will never let me go away. It is like a cat playing with a mouse. Just when the poor little mouse thinks at last it is safe, the blow falls. Even today, oh Tony, look. As she spoke, she sprang to her feet. Anthony turned. At first sight there seemed nothing to account for her agitation, just a very ordinary-looking man coming towards them from the direction of the broad walk. But as Tony looked he caught his breath sharply. Cecily did not wait for him to speak. Stop him! Stop him! She cried feverishly. Don't let him come after me. Keep him here until I have got away. She sped down the path towards Lancaster Gate. Anthony went forward to meet the newcomer. Good morning, Mr. Stedman, he said, endeavoring to make his voice sound as natural as possible. Good morning, Tony. John Stedman shook hands with him warmly, his keen eyes taking in all the tokens of disturbance on the young man's face. I am afraid my appearance is rather inopportune, he went on. Isn't that your young woman beating a hasty retreat down there? In the distance Cecily's scurrying figure could plainly be seen. Yes, she is in a hurry, Anthony said lamely. Obviously. The barrister smiled. But I am glad to have this opportunity of seeing you, Tony. I have been hoping to meet you. Mindful of Cecily's parting injunction, Tony turned to the seat behind. Have a cigarette, sir? The barrister shook his head as he glanced at the open cigarette case. Duresca. No thanks. You are a bit too extravagant for me, young man. I always smoke Gaspers myself. He sat down and took out his own case. You of course don't condescend to gold flake, he went on. I am rather glad of this opportunity of having a chat with you, Tony. Tony lighted his cigarette and threw the match away before he spoke, then he turned and looked John Stedman squarely in the face. I dare say you are, Mr. Stedman. So is your friend, Inspector Furnival. Whenever I meet him, I notice. The barrister paused in the act of lighting his match. You mean? I mean that, if folks think I murdered my uncle, I would just as soon they said so straight out, as come poking around asking questions and trying to trap me, Anthony retorted bitterly. John Stedman finished lighting his cigarette and blew a couple of spirals in the clear air before he spoke, then he said slowly. The thought that you murdered your Uncle Luke is about the last that would enter my head, Tony. No. What I wanted to ask you was, does that job of yours stand, bear leader to the young brother of a friend of yours, I mean? The last time I saw you, you spoke as if it were off. So it is. Anthony returned moodily. People don't want a man who is as good as accused of murdering his own uncle to look after their children. I might strangle the kid if he got tiresome. The barrister paid no attention to this outburst. Then I think I heard of something yesterday that may suit you. A friend of mine has a son who was frightfully injured in the war. Both his legs have been amputated and one wrist is practically helpless. Now he wants someone to act as his secretary, for he has taken to writing novels, passes the time for him, you know, and folks need not read them if they don't want to. It is very good of you to think of me, Anthony said gratefully. But I don't know that I should make much hand at secretarial work. And probably he wouldn't look at me if he knew. He does know, contradicted John Stedman. And he is quite anxious to have you. It won't be all secretarial work, though you'll be called a secretary. But you will be wanted to motor with him, to go with him to race meetings. He is a great motoring enthusiast, keeps 2 touring cars. Before the war he was one of our finest amateur jockeys, and they say he never misses a meeting under NH rules now. I believe he even has a couple of hurdlers at one of the big trainers. You will have to go with him wherever he wants you. How does it strike you? The question is, how shall I strike him? Tony countered. Will he think he is safe with me? Tony, my lad, you must not get morbid, reproved the barrister. My friends know all about your connection with the Betchcombes, and are quite prepared to take you on my recommendation. You would not be required to live in, and there is a nice little cottage on the estate near the house that will be placed at your disposal. Your salary will be good, and with what your uncle left you will make matrimony quite possible. Now what do you say?" "Say? What can I say but take it and be thankful?" Tony responded, trying to make his tones sound as grateful as he could. "Would it be far from town, this cottage?" "Oh, not far," the barrister said at once. "At Bramley Hall, near Burford, in the New Forest. It is young Bramley, Sir John's eldest son, you are wanted for." "Bramley Hall," Tony repeated musingly. "I seem to know the name. Wasn't there a burglary there a little while ago?" "About 18 months ago," the barrister assented. "The house was practically cleared of valuables in one night. Even Sir John's safe, which he had deemed impregnable, was rifled. Oh yes, it made quite a stir. It was said to be the work of this yellow gang that folks are always talking about, you know." Chapter 12. "I guess you are Inspector Furnival, sir." The inspector, with Mr. Stedman, was just about to enter New Scotland Yard. He glanced keenly at his interlocutor. He saw a tall, lantern-jawed, lean-shanked man who seemed in some indescribable way to carry Yankee writ large all over him. The detective's face cleared. "Why, certainly, I am William Furnival, sir." "And you are in charge of the Betchcombe case?" "Well, I may say I am," the inspector agreed. "And I think you are Mr. Cyril B. Carnthwack." "Sure thing. And no reason to be ashamed of my name either," the other said truculently, rather as if he expected the inspector to challenge his statement. The inspector, however, was looking his blandest. "The name of Cyril B. Carnthwack is one to conjure with not only in your own country but in ours," he said politely. "Did you wish to speak to me, sir?" "I did, very particularly," responded Mr. Carnthwack. But, with a glance at Mr. Stedman, this gentleman. "Mr. Stedman, sir, the late Mr. Betchcombe's cousin, and at one time one of the best-known criminal lawyers practicing at the bar. He has been kind enough to place his experience at our disposal in this most perplexing case. Will you come into my office, Mr. Carnthwack?" "Of course, we can't stand out in the street," responded the millionaire. The inspector led the way to his private room and then, clearing a lot of papers from the nearest chair, set it forward. Mr. Carnthwack sat down with a word of thanks. John Stedman took up his position with his back to the fireplace. The inspector dropped into his revolving chair and looked at his visitor. "I am at your service, sir." Carnthwack settled himself in his chair and looked back. "I guess you two gentlemen know pretty well what has brought me here. Mrs. Carnthwack is at home laid up in bed with the worry of the past few days. I calculate she isn't exactly the stuff criminals are made of. So here I have come in her place for a straight talk face to face. She has told me all about her doings on the day Mr. Betchcombe was murdered. And she told me that she had been to you on the same subject. So I guess you fairly well know what I have come to talk about." "Yes, Mrs. Carnthwack did come to us," the inspector assented. "It would have been wiser to have come earlier." "It would," agreed Mr. Carnthwack. "But women ain't the wisest of creatures, even if they are not scared out of their wits as Mrs. Carnthwack was when she realized that she was the lady of the glove, that every newspaper in the kingdom was making such a clamor about." "Perhaps it was a good thing for her that she was," remarked the inspector enigmatically. Cyril B. Carnthwack stared at him. "I don't comprehend. I wasn't aware you dealt in conundrums, Inspector." "No," the inspector said as he opened a drawer and began to rummage in it. "Ah, here we are. This is the report of the expert in fingerprints, and it shows that it was impossible for the fingers that fitted into this glove to have made the prints on Mr. Betchcombe's throat. They were much too small." "I grasp your meaning." Mr. Carnthwack sat back in his chair and put his elbows on the arms, joining the tips of his fingers together and surveying them with much interest. "But I reckon I didn't need this corroboration. My wife's word is the goods for me. I guess you gentlemen have tumbled to it that it is to make some inquiries about the diamonds that I have come butting in this morning." The inspector bowed. "I thought it quite likely. Now, I have made certain that by your laws as well as ours the late Mr. Betchcombe's estate is liable for the value of Mrs. Carnthwack's jewels, since he gave my wife a receipt for them, which I believe is held by you gentlemen now," the American said, speaking with a strong nasal accent. Again the inspector nodded his assent. "Certainly it is. What do you suppose to be the value of the diamonds, Mr. Carnthwack?" "Well, I couldn't figure it off in a minute," the millionaire said in a considering tone. but a good many thousands of dollars anyway. I did not buy them all at once, but picked up a few good ones when I got a chance. Thought to myself, diamonds were always an investment. The gem of the whole lot was the necklace. It was part of the Russian crown jewels and had been worn by the ill-fated Tsarina herself. But anyhow, I guess my wife's diamonds were pretty well known in London, and they were valuable enough to excite the cupidity of this gang of criminals that have been so busy about London of late. You see, I suppose, that it was in order to get them that they broke into Mr. Betchcomb's office and strangled him. John Stedman raised his eyebrows as he looked across at the inspector. That worthy coughed. You are rather jumping to conclusions, it seems to me, Mr. Carnthwack. In the first place, Mr. Betchcomb's office was not broken into. The murderer, whoever he might have been, entered in the usual fashion and apparently in no way alarmed Mr. Betchcombe. In fact, all the indications go to prove that the assassin was someone known to Mr. Betchcombe. I don't figure that out. Carnthwack hunched his shoulders and looked obstinate. I will take what odds you like that my wife was followed and that, unable to get what he wanted without, the thief strangled Mr. Betchcombe and walked off with the diamonds. The diamonds certainly provide a very adequate motive, John Stedman said slowly, taking part in the conversation for the first time. But there are some very weak points in your story, Mr. Carnthwack. You must remember that the rubber gloves worn by the assassin as well as the chloroform used seem to prove conclusively that the murder was planned beforehand. There was a pause. That may be, but I don't see that it precludes the motive being the theft of my wife's diamonds, said Carnthwack truculently. You spoke of Mrs. Carnthwack's being followed, and of the follower assaulting Mr. Betchcombe and strangling him in the struggle. That rather suggests an accidental discovery of Mrs. Carnthwack's errand to me, John Stedman hazarded mildly. It doesn't suggest anything of the kind to me, the American contradicted obstinately. Of course somebody had discovered my wife's errand, what it was and what time she was to be there, and followed her there for the express purpose of getting them. I should have thought it would have been easier to snatch them from Mrs. Carnthwack than to get them from Mr. Betchcombe, John Stedman went on, his eyes watching every change of expression in the other's face. You wouldn't have if you had heard the strength of Mrs. Carnthwack's lungs, Mr. Carnthwack contradicted. It would have been devilish difficult to get the diamonds from her. She only left the car at the archway too, and she carried the jewels concealed beneath her coat. It would have been a bold thief who would have attacked her, crossing that bit of a square in front or coming up the steps to the office. No. It was a wiser plan to wait and take them from Mr. Betchcombe. I don't think so, and I think you are wrong, John Stedman dissented. The most probable thing would have been for Mr. Betchcombe to have deposited the diamonds in the safe while Mrs. Carnthwack was there. That he did not do so is one of the minor puzzles of the case. I cannot understand why he should put them in the cupboard pointed out by Mrs. Carnthwack, and why he should call it his safe I cannot imagine. He might almost have intended to make things easy for the thief. I wonder whether he did, Carnthwack said very deliberately. His words had all the force of a bombshell. The other two men stared at him in amazement. I do not understand you, John Stedman said at last, his tone haughty in its repressive surprise. But Cyril B. Carnthwack was not to be easily repressed. Well, I reckoned I might as well mention the idea, which is an idea that has occurred to more than me. But then I didn't want to put up the dander of you two gentlemen, and you in particular, with a polite inclination in the direction of Mr. Stedman, being a cousin of the late Mr. Betchcombe. But I was at a man's dinner last night, and it was pretty freely canvassed. It is hinted that Mr. Betchcombe might have been in difficulties in his accounts. I understand that there are pretty considerable deficiencies in his balance. And though they are all put down by the police to that clerk that can't be found, well, doesn't it pretty well jump to your eye that the late Mr. Betchcombe himself knew all about them, and that it might have suited his book to have my wife's jewels stolen, perhaps by a confederate, the clerk Thompson or another, and arranged to get himself murdered to get suspicion thrown off himself? Mr. Stedman inquired satirically as the other paused for breath. No, not that exactly, though I guess he was pretty slick, returned Carnthwack equably. But I am inclined to size it up that the two had a quarrel and that the other one killed Mr. Betchcombe. Are you indeed? Questioned John Stedman, a glitter in his eye that would have warned his juniors that the old man was going to be nasty. But the K.C. had rarely lost his temper so completely as today. I can tell you at once that your idea is nothing but a lie, moreover, that has its foundation in your own foul imagination, he said very deliberately. Luke Betchcombe was the soul of honor. I would answer for him as I would for myself. That is very satisfactory, drawled Carnthwack. Most satisfactory, I am sure. Well, since that question is settled, I will ask another. Was Mr. Betchcomb's face injured at all? The other two looked surprised at this question. Why no, the inspector answered. There was not even a scratch upon it. Why do you ask? Another idea, responded Mr. Carnthwack cheerfully. Another idea. But my last wasn't a success. I guess I will keep this to myself for a time. One cannot help seeing that the rubber gloves and the chloroform pretty well dispose of your idea, as they have disposed of a good many others, the inspector remarked. No, I believe the murder to have been deliberately planned, but I don't think it was the work of one man alone. There have been more jewel robberies in London in the past year than I ever remember, and I am inclined to believe that most of them may be set down to the same gang. The Yellow Gang, interjected the millionaire. I have heard of it. The Yellow Gang, if you like to call it so, acquiesced the inspector. But then there comes up the question, how should they know that Mrs. Carnthwack was taking her jewels to Mr. Betchcombe that morning? And why does that puzzle you? Mr. Carnthwack inquired blandly. The inspector glanced at him keenly. Mrs. Carnthwack informed me that no one at all knew that she was thinking of parting with her jewels, and that her visit to Mr. Betchcombe that morning had been kept a profound secret. Mr. Carnthwack threw himself back in his chair and gave vent to a short, sharp laugh. I guess you are not a married man, Inspector, or you would talk in a different fashion to that. Is there a woman alive who could keep a secret? If there is, it isn't Mrs. Cyril B. Carnthwack. Nobody knew. Bless your life, I knew well enough she was in debt and had made up her mind to sell her jewels to Betchcombe. I didn't know the exact time certainly, but that was because I didn't take the trouble to find out. Bless your life, there are no flies on Cyril B. Carnthwack. He turned to find Inspector Furnival beside him. A spasm of fear shot through Tony. Was this man ubiquitous? And what was he doing here? Going to Mrs. Luke Betchcomb's, sir? The inspector went on. Mr. Stedman has just left me to go on there in his car. A family party to celebrate Mr. Aubrey Todmarsh's engagement. Yes, to Mrs. Phillimore, Tony assented. The gate was thrust aside now. The inspector and Tony found themselves pushed along by the people behind. They went on the platform together, the inspector keeping closely by Tony's side. Wonderful man, Mr. Todmarsh, he began conversationally. We in the police see a lot of his work. Mrs. Phillimore, too, supports practically every philanthropic work in the East End. Yes, this engagement will be good news to many a poor outcast, Mr. Anthony. Tony mechanically acquiesced. As a matter of fact, mention of Aubrey Todmarsh's good works left him cold. He had no great liking for Mrs. Phillimore either, though the rich American had rather gone out of her way to be amiable to him. This morning, however, he was too much occupied in wondering what was the ulterior motive for the inspector's friendliness to have any thought to spare for his cousin's engagement. He was anxious to ascertain whether the inspector, like himself, had caught sight of Cecily Hoyle and followed her, though he could not form any idea as to the inspector's object in doing so. Still, one never knew where the clues spoken of by the papers might lead the police. Thinking of Cecily as the inspector's possible objective, a cold sweat broke out on Anthony's brow. When the train came in, the inspector stood aside for Anthony to enter and followed him in. The carriage was full. Anthony had an uncomfortable feeling that people were looking at him. Possibly, he thought, they were pointing him out to one another as Luke Betchcomb's nephew, the one who stood to benefit largely by the murdered man's death, and still more largely at the death of the widow, were wondering possibly what he was doing in that half hour on the day of the murder, which he could only account for by saying he was wandering about looking for the field of rest. That the general public had at first looked upon him as suspect on this account Anthony knew, but he knew also that the discovery of the clerk Thompson's dishonesty and later on of the loss of Mrs. Carnthwack's diamonds had been taken as clearing him to a great extent. Until the mystery surrounding the death of Luke Betchcombe had been solved, however, he recognized that he would remain a potential murderer in the eyes of at least a section of the public. Possibly, he reflected grimly, seeing him with the inspector this morning, they thought he was in custody. Going far, Inspector? He asked at the first stopping place. Same station as yourself, sir, the inspector returned affably. Matter of fact, I am going to the same house too. A message came along for Mr. Stedman just after he had started, and as it seemed to be of some importance, I thought I would come after him with it myself. I am hoping to be in time to have a word with him before luncheon. Perhaps you could help me, sir. Well, if I can, Anthony said doubtfully. There won't be much time to spare, though. Well, if I am too late, I am too late, the inspector remarked philosophically. It was just a chance. We don't seem to hear of Thompson, sir. We don't, Anthony assented. And I expect he is taking care we shouldn't. You'll forgive me, Inspector, but the way Thompson has managed to disappear doesn't seem to me to reflect much credit on the police. I know that is the sort of thing folks are saying, the inspector commented with apparent placidity. And it is a great deal easier to say it about the police methods than to improve upon them. However, like some others, Thompson may find himself caught in time. One of our great difficulties is that so little is known about him, his friends, habits, etc. Even you don't seem able to help us there, Mr. Anthony. The inspector shot a lightning glance at the young man's unconscious face. Anthony shook his head. Always was a decent sort of chap, old Thompson, or he seemed so. I always had a bit of a rag with him when I went to the office. Known him there years, of course. But if you come to ask me about his friends, I never saw the old chap in mufti, as you might say, in my life. Still, I don't think Thompson had any hand in murdering Uncle Luke. I know. You have said so all along, the inspector remarked. But if you don't think he had anything to do with the murder, what do you think of his disappearance? Suppose the old chap had been helping himself to what wasn't his, and got frightened and bolted. Yes. The inspector stroked his chin thoughtfully. Do you think you would recognize Thompson in the street, Mr. Anthony? Should think I was a blithering idiot if I didn't, Anthony responded. Never saw him with a hat on certainly, but a hat don't matter, it can't alter a man beyond recognition. Not much of a disguise certainly, the inspector admitted, looking round him consideringly as they entered Carlsford Square. Still, I wonder. Anthony came to a standstill. Now I wonder what you are getting at. Do you think I have seen Thompson anywhere? The inspector did not answer for a minute, then he said slowly. I shouldn't be surprised if a good many of us had seen him, Mr. Anthony. Anthony stared. Then we must be a set of fools. A good many of us are fools, Inspector Furnival acquiesced as they came to a standstill. Anthony applied himself to the knocker on the door of the Betchcombes' house. There were a couple of cars in the street, one John Stedman's, the other a luxurious Daimler evidently fitted with the latest improvements. You will have time for your talk, old chap, said Anthony, looking at his watch as the door opened. Somewhat to his surprise, Stedman came out. The barrister for once was not looking as immaculately neat as usual. His coat was dusty and he was carrying his right arm stiffly. He held out a note to his chauffeur. There. It's quite close to Stepney Causeway. Get the woman to the hospital as soon as possible. Hello, Inspector, a word with you. He was turning with the inspector when Tony interrupted. You look as if you had been in the wars, sir. Have you had an accident? No, responded the barrister curtly. Then with a jerk of his head in the direction of the other car. That fellow, Mrs. Phillamore's man, isn't fit to drive a donkey cart. Nearly ran over a child just now. All we could do to get her out alive save with a broken arm. I took her to the Middlesex hospital and now I'm sending for her mother. Mrs. Phillimore doesn't seem very helpful except in the matter of weeping. Well, so long, my boy, see you again in a minute or two. He turned off with the inspector. Anthony went through the hall to the drawing room where he found his father. Today, however, he did not receive his usual smile, and he saw that in spite of her makeup she was looking pale and worried. Where is Aubrey? He inquired, as he shook hands. Got a holiday from his blessed community today, I suppose? Oh yes, she returned. He was to have brought me here, but he was sent for, I couldn't quite understand by whom. But he said he should not be long after me. Nor has he, interposed Mrs. Betchcombe at this juncture. He is coming up the steps now with John Stedman. Mrs. Phillamore's relief was apparent in her countenance. Anthony felt a touch of momentary wonder as to why his cousin's temporary absence should cause her so much apparent anxiety. Aubrey was talking to Mr. Stedman in a quick, nervous fashion as they entered the room together. The first glance was enough to show everyone that something had seriously disturbed Aubrey Todmarsh. His face was white, his eyes were bloodshot, he was biting his lips nervously. Altogether he looked strangely unlike the enthusiastic young head of the community of St. Philip. Mr. Collier was the first to speak. Aubrey, my dear boy, is anything the matter? Apparently Todmarsh only brought himself to speak with difficulty. Twice he opened his lips, but no words came. At last he said hoarsely, Hopkins. The name conveyed nothing to the majority of his hearers. Only the rector of Wexbridge twisted up his face into a curious resemblance to a note of interrogation, and Mrs. Phillimore uttered a sharp little cry. "Hopkins! Oh, Aubrey!" "Hopkins," he repeated. He is my right hand, you know, Uncle James. I would have staked my life on Hopkins." The clergyman pushed a chair up to his nephew. "Sit down, my dear boy. What is this about Hopkins? I remember him well. Has he? He has been away for a few days' holiday. He said his sister was ill and he must go to see her." In the early hours of this morning, Todmarsh's voice grew increasingly husky. He was arrested with 2 other men breaking into Sir Thomas Refford's house, Wistone Hall in the New Forest. I can't believe it." His head fell forward on his hands. Mrs. Phillimore drew a long breath, and for a moment nobody spoke. Then the rector said slowly, "My dear boy, I can hardly believe this is true. Is there no possibility of a mistake? A false report or something of that kind?" Aubrey shook his head. "No. The telegram came from Refford Hall Post Office. Hopkins sent it himself to me at the community house and it was brought to me here. Dear. I wish I could help you. But you must remember, my dear Aubrey, that we workers for others must be prepared to meet trouble and disappointment, even in those of whom we have felt most sure." The rector laid his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Pull yourself together, my dear Aubrey. Remember the many signal causes of thankfulness that have been granted to you. The many other lives that you have brightened and saved from shame. How can I tell who will be the next?" Todmarsh groaned. "I tell you, I would have staked my life on Hopkins." "We cannot answer for our brothers, any of us," Mr. Collier went on. "But now, my boy, you must make an effort. You must think of your Aunt Madeline, of Mrs. Phillimore." There was a moment's silence, then Todmarsh raised his head. "You are right. You always do me more good than anyone else, Uncle James. But here I am keeping you all waiting. I beg your pardon, Aunt Madeline. And after lunch there is much to be done. I must see about getting Hopkins bailed out." "Where is Hopkins?" questioned Anthony, taking part in the conversation for the first time. "At a place called Birchester," Aubrey answered. "I fancy it is quite a small place. Probably it is the nearest police court to Wistone Hall." "Wistone Hall, in the New Forest, you said, didn't you?" Anthony went on. "Is it near Burford, do you know?" He hardly knew what made him ask the question. John Stedman glanced at him sharply. Aubrey Todmarsh turned a surprised face towards him. "I don't know. I don't know anything about the place. And I never heard of Burford." Chapter 14. Luncheon, not a particularly cheerful meal, was over. Mrs. Phillimore's jeweled cigarette case lay on the table beside her, but her cigarette had gone out in its amber holder, and her eyes were furtively watching her fiancé as she chatted with Mr. Collier, who sat opposite. Aubrey Todmarsh had taken his uncle's advice and pulled himself together. He was talking much as usual now, but John Stedman, watching him from his seat opposite, thought that his face looked queer and strained. His eyes no longer seemed to see visions, but were bloodshot and weary. His high cheekbones had the skin drawn tightly across them today and gave him almost a Mongolian look. His usually sleek dark hair was ruffled across his forehead. John Stedman had not hitherto felt particularly attracted by the young head of the community of St. Philip. Apart from the natural contempt of the ordinary man for a conscientious objector, there always to Stedman appeared something wild and ridiculous about Todmarsh's visionary speeches and ideas. Today, however, his sympathies were aroused by the young man's obviously very great disappointment over Hopkins's defection. He felt sorry for Mrs. Phillimore too. The poor little widow was evidently sharing her lover's depression, and though she did her best to appear bright and cheerful, was watching him anxiously while she talked to her hostess or to Stedman himself. It seemed to Stedman that he had never realized how protracted a meal luncheon could be until today, and he was on the point of making some excuse to Mrs. Betchcombe for effecting an early retreat when the parlour-maid entered the room with 2 cards, on one of which a few words were written, upon her silver salver. Mrs. Betchcombe took them up with a murmured excuse. She glanced at them carelessly, then her expression changed. She looked round in indecision, then turned to Stedman. I don't know what to do. That woman." The momentary lull in the conversation had passed. Everyone was talking busily. Under cover of the hum, Stedman edged himself a little nearer his hostess. "What woman?" For answer she handed him the larger of the 2 cards. "Mrs. Cyril B. Carnthwack," he read. He glanced at Mrs. Betchcombe. What does this mean? That woman, I have always felt certain she was responsible for Luke's death, Mrs. Betchcombe returned incoherently. Oh yes, as Stedman made a movement of dissent. If she did not actually kill him herself, she took her horrid diamonds to him and let the murderer know and follow her. Oh yes, I shall always hold her responsible. But today you see he, the man says their business is important. Perhaps he has found out something. What am I to do? Why not ask them to come in here? John Stedman suggested. We are all members of the family, glancing round the room. Mrs. Betchcombe hesitated. Aubrey Todmarsh sprang to his feet. I must go, Aunt Madeline. I have to see about bail for Hopkins, and that he is legally represented. And besides, I don't really feel that I can stand any more today. His face was working as he spoke, and they all looked at him sympathetically as he hurriedly shook hands with Mrs. Betchcombe. His absorption in Hopkins's backsliding was so evidently of first consideration, rendering him oblivious even of his fiancée. As for the poor little butterfly, her spirits, which had been gradually rising, seemed to be finally damped by this last contretemps. She raised no objection to her lover's abrupt departure, but sat silent and depressed until the Carnthwacks were ushered into the room. One glance was enough to show John Stedman that both the American and his wife were looking strangely disturbed. They went straight up to Mrs. Betchcombe. I am obliged to you, ma'am, for receiving us, Carnthwack began, while his wife laid her hand on Aubrey Todmarsh's vacant chair as though to steady herself. You said it was important. Mrs. Betchcombe's manner was distant. She did not glance at Mrs. Carnthwack. So it is, ma'am, very important, the American assented. Sure thing that, else I wouldn't have ventured to butt in this morning. Though if I had gathered your guests were so numerous, looking round comprehensively and making a slight courteous bow to Stedman and Collier, but I don't know. It is best that a thing of this importance should be settled at once. As he spoke, he was slowly removing the brown paper covering from a small parcel he had taken from his breast pocket. Watching him curiously, Stedman saw to his amazement that when the contents were finally extracted they appeared to be nothing more important than the day's issue of an illustrated paper. Carnthwack spread it out. Then he looked back at Mrs. Betchcombe. I don't want to hurt your feelings, ma'am. And it may be that someone else belonging to the house, perhaps the gentleman I saw down at the yard, with a gesture in Stedman's direction, would just look at this picture. Stedman stepped forward. But Mrs. Betchcombe's curiosity had been aroused. She leaned across. I will see it myself, please. Carnthwack laid it on the table before the astonished eyes of the company. A glance showed John Stedman that the center print was a quite recognizable portrait of Luke Betchcombe. There were also pictures of the offices in Crow's Inn, both inside and out, an obviously fancy likeness of Thompson the absconding manager, and of Miss Cecily Hoyle, the dead man's secretary. Stedman half expected to find Mrs. Cyril B. Carnthwack figuring largely, but so far as he could see there was nothing to account for that lady's excessive agitation. She passed her handkerchief over her lips now as she sat down sideways on the chair that Tony Collier placed for her, and he noticed that she was trembling all over and that every drop of color seemed to have receded from her cheeks and lips. Her admirers on the variety stage would not have recognized their idol now. Carnthwack cleared a space on the table and spread out his paper carefully, smoothing out the creases with meticulous attention. Then he pointed his carefully manicured forefinger at the portrait of Luke Betchcombe in the middle. Would you call that a reasonably good picture of your late husband, ma'am? Mrs. Betchcombe drew her eyebrows together as she bent over it. Yes, it is very, she said decidedly. I should say unusually good for this class of paper. It is copied from one of the last photographs he had taken, one he sat for when we were staying with his sister in the country. You remember, James? Appealing to the rector. Mr. Collier smiled sadly. Indeed I do. We were all sitting on the lawn and that friend of Tony's, Leonard Barnes, insisted on taking us all. Poor Luke's was particularly good. Why are you asking, Mr. Carnthwack? Carnthwack wagged his yellow forefinger reprovingly in the direction of the rector. One moment, Reverend Sir. It may be, ma'am, that you have another portrait of your lamented husband that you could let us glimpse. Mrs. Betchcombe hesitated a moment and glanced nervously at John Stedman. In spite of all her preconceived notions, the American was beginning to impress her. There was something in his manner, restrained yet with a sinister undercurrent, that filled her with a sense of some hitherto unguessed at, unnameable dread. At last, moving like a woman in a dream, She went across to the writing table that stood between the two tall windows overlooking the square, and unlocking a drawer took out a cabinet photograph. There, that is the most recent, and I think the best we have. It was taken at Frank and Burroughs, the big photographers in Baker Street. Allow me, ma'am. Cyril B. Carnthwack held out his hand. He studied the photograph silently for a minute or two, laying it beside the paper and apparently comparing the two. Everybody in the room watched him with curious, interested eyes. His wife sat crouching against the table, leaning over it, her handkerchief, crushed into a hard little ball, pressed against her lips. At last Carnthwack laid both the portraits down together and stood up with an air of finality. Mrs. Carnthwack, I rather fancy the moment to speak has come. Now don't fuss yourself, but just tell these ladies and gentlemen what you have to say simply, same way as you did to me. It seemed at first, as Mrs. Carnthwack appeared to struggle for breath and caught convulsively at her husband's hand, that she would not be able to speak at all. But his firm clasp drew her up. The magnetism of his gaze compelled her words. If that is Mr. Betchcombe, she said very slowly, that portrait, I mean, and if it is a really good likeness of him, I can only say, she paused again and gulped something down in her throat, that is not the man I saw at the office, not the man to whom I gave my diamonds. A tense silence followed this avowal, a silence that was broken at last by a moan from Mrs. Betchcombe. What do you mean? What does she mean? There was another momentary silence, broken this time by John Stedman. He had remained standing since the Carnthwacks came in, on the other side of the table. He came round towards them now. I think you must give us a little further explanation, Mrs. Carnthwack, he said courteously. Mrs. Carnthwack was pressing the little ball that had been her handkerchief to her lips again. She turned from him with a quick gesture as though to shut him, the other guests, the whole room, out of her sight. Her husband laid his hand on her shoulder, heavily yet with a certain comfort in its very contact. That is all right, old girl. You just keep quiet and leave it to me. She can't give you any explanation. That is just all she can say, he went on in a determined, almost a hostile voice. As soon as she saw that portrait she knew if that was Luke Betchcombe, that she never saw him at all on the day of his death, that she gave the diamonds to someone else, someone impersonating him. And who, inquired John Stedman in that quiet, lazy voice of his, do you imagine could have impersonated Luke Betchcombe? The American looked him squarely in the eyes. That's for you legal gentlemen to decide. It is not for me to come butting in. But I can put you wise on one thing that stares one right in the face, so to speak, that I can say before I quit. I don't guess who it was who impersonated Luke Betchcombe, or where he came from or how he got right there. But there is only one man it could have been, and that is the murderer. Chapter 15. He looked from one to another as he spoke, and as he met John Stedman's glance his gray eyes were as hard as steel and his thin lips were drawn and pinched together like a trap. The horror in his hearers' faces grew and strengthened. Mrs. Betchcombe alone tried to speak. She leaned forward. In some inscrutable fashion her figure seemed to have shrunk in the last few minutes. She looked bent and worn and old, 10 years older than Luke Betchcombe's handsome wife had done. Her face was white and rigid and set like a death mask. Only her eyes, vivid, burning, looked alive. No sound came from her parted lips for a moment. Then with a hoarse croak she threw up her hands to her throat as though she would tear the very words out. What was he like? Mrs. Carnthwack cast one glance at her and began to tremble all over, then she clutched violently at her husband's hand. It is easier to say that he wasn't like that portrait, she confessed, than to tell you what he really was like. He gave me the impression that he was a bigger man. His beard too was not neat and trimmed like that, short, stubby and untidy looking. His hair grew low down on his forehead. That man's hair, pointing with shaking fingers to the paper portrait, grows far back. He is even a little bald. I don't know that I can point out any other differences, but the two faces are not a bit alike really. Oh, if I had only known Mr. Betchcombe by sight this dreadful thing might never have happened. She leaned back in her chair trembling violently. Carnthwack placed himself very deliberately between her and the rest of the room. His clasp of her cold hands tightened. Now, be a sensible girl, he admonished, giving her a little shake as he spoke, yet with a very real tenderness in his gruff tones. Quit crying and shaking and just say what you have to say as quietly as possible. Nobody can hurt you for that. And if they do try to, they will have to reckon with Cyril B. Carnthwack. Now, sir. He looked at John Stedman. I guess there will be other questions you'll have to ask, and it may be as well to get as much as we can over at once." The barrister cleared his throat. "I am afraid it will be impossible to do that here. The very first thing to be done is to inform Scotland Yard of Mrs. Carnthwack's tragic discovery." The American bent over his wife for a minute, then drew aside. "I guess it will have to be as the gentleman says, Mrs. Carnthwack. Now just as plain as you can put it, and remember that I am standing beside you." Mrs. Carnthwack drew one of her hands from his and passed her handkerchief over her parched lips. Then she looked at Stedman. It seemed to him that it was only by a supreme effort that she became articulate at all. "I knocked at the door. I knew how to find it. Mr. Betchcombe had told me how on the phone. Down the passage to the right, past the clerk's office. It wasn't opened at once. I heard someone moving about rather stumblingly, and I was just going to knock again when the door was opened and—" She stopped, shivering violently. Now then," admonished her husband. "You just quit thinking of what you are wise about now, and tell us just what took place as quickly as you can." Mrs. Carnthwack appeared anxious to obey him. He opened the door, the man I told you about." "Come in, Mrs. Carnthwack," he said. "I never doubted its being Mr. Betchcombe. Why should I? He knew my name and my errand. Certainly I thought he had an unpleasant voice, husky, not like what I had heard when I rang him up. But he said he had a cold." She stopped again. This time John Stedman interposed. "Now the details of your interview you have told us before." "Ever so many times," she sobbed. "I can't say anything but what I told you at the inquest. But now that this extraordinary new light has been thrown upon everything, do you recollect anything that may help us? You know the various trifles sometimes provide the most successful clues, a mark on hands or face, for example." "There wasn't any," Mrs. Carnthwack answered, shaking visibly. "Or if there was, I didn't see it. But my eyesight isn't what it was, and the room was very dark, so I couldn't see very well." "Dark? I shouldn't call it a dark room," contradicted John Stedman. "And the day was a clear one, I know." "The room itself mightn't be dark," Mrs. Carnthwack said obstinately. "But the blinds were drawn partly down and that heavy screen before the window nearest the desk would darken any room." "Screen?" John Stedman repeated in a puzzled tone. "I have seen no screen near the window." "Oh, but there is one," Mrs. Carnthwack affirmed positively. "A big heavy screen, stamped leather it looked like. It was opened out, and stood right in front of the window nearest the desk. I remember wondering he should have it there. It blocked out so much of the light." "What a very curious thing." The rector interjected. "Often as I have been in to see my lamented brother-in-law, I have seen no screen, nor have I found him with drawn blinds." "It was not Mr. Betchcombe who was so found by Mrs. Carnthwack," John Stedman corrected. "Of course the semi-darkness of the room was purposely contrived for one of two reasons, either that the murderer should not be recognized or that his disguise should not be suspected." "Your two reasons seem to me to mean the same thing, my dear sir," Carnthwack drawled. "But there, if that is all." "They do not mean the same thing at all," John Stedman retorted. "Anybody might suspect a person of being disguised. But only someone who was personally acquainted with the murderer could recognize him. Now what we have to discover is which of these reasons was operating in this case. Or whether, as is possible, we have to reckon with both." Cyril B. Carnthwack's sleepy-looking eyes were opened sharply for once. "I don't understand you," he drawled. "But I can put you wise on one of your points. Mrs. Carnthwack ain't acquainted with any murderers. So she could not have recognized the man." The barrister did not appear to be impressed. "Nobody is aware that he is acquainted with murderers until the murderer is found out," he remarked with a certain air of stubbornness. "Besides, it might not have been for Mrs. Carnthwack that this murderer had to fear recognition. He may have been known by sight to lots of people who might possibly have encountered him on his way to and from the room. All the clerks, for example, the messengers, office boys, tenants of the neighboring offices. Other people might have come to Mr. Betchcombe's private room too. Mrs. Carnthwack may not have been the only expected client. But one thing is certain, this new evidence of Mrs. Carnthwack's does throw a good deal of light on the much vexed question of the time at which the murder took place." "As how?" Carnthwack's voice did not sound as though he would be easily placated. Stedman shrugged his shoulders. Don't you realize that the medical testimony that Luke Betchcombe met his death soon after 12 o'clock has always been at variance with Mrs. Carnthwack's statement that she saw him alive and well at 1 o'clock, and afterwards Miss Hoyle too heard someone moving about in Mr. Betchcomb's room when she returned from lunch? Now we realize that the doctors were right and that Mrs. Carnthwack's interview took place with the murderer and that Miss Hoyle. The last word was interrupted by a hoarse, muffled shriek from Mrs. Carnthwack. "I can't bear it, Cyril. If you don't take me away, I shall die." The American looked round doubtfully, then he drew her to her feet and supported her with one arm. "Guess there is nothing to be gained by staying any longer," he said, a certain note of truculence in his voice as he met Stedman's eyes. "You know where to find us if you want us. Come then, little woman, we will just say good morning." No one made any effort to detain them as they went towards the door. John Stedman followed them into the hall. Carnthwack was bending over his wife and saying something to her in a low, earnest voice. As John Stedman came up to them he turned. "Guess that little fair lady on your side the table is someone you know well, sir?" Stedman looked at him curiously. "Well, fairly well. She is engaged to Luke Betchcomb's nephew. She is a compatriot of yours too, a Mrs. Phillimore." "Gee whiz!" ejaculated the American. "And is that Mrs. Phillimore? You have heard of her?" Stedman questioned. "Reckon I have," Carnthwack assented, "and seen her too. Though it don't seem to me she was called Phillimore then." "Before she was married perhaps," suggested Stedman. "Perhaps," drawled the American. "Anyway, I have glimpsed the lady somewhere. Americans mostly know one another by sight, you know," a faint twinkle in his eye as he glanced over his wife's head at the barrister. When Stedman went back to the dining room, Mrs. Betchcombe was lying back in her chair, apparently in a state of collapse. Mrs. Phillimore was bending over her, looking very little better herself. All her little butterfly airs and graces had fallen from her. Her makeup could not disguise the extreme pallor of her cheeks. The great blue eyes were full of horror and of dread. She was trying to persuade Mrs. Betchcombe to drink a glass of wine which Mr. Collier had poured out for her. But as Stedman re-entered the room, Mrs. Betchcombe sprang up, pushing Mrs. Phillimore aside and throwing the wine over the tablecloth. "Have you let her go?" Stedman looked at her. "Control yourself, my dear Madeline. Let who go?" That woman. That Mrs. Carnthwack," Mrs. Betchcombe stormed hysterically. "I thought at least that you could see through her, that you had gone with her to make sure that she was arrested, that—" A gleam of pity shone in Stedman's eyes as he watched her, pity that was oddly mingled with some other feeling. "There is not the slightest ground for arresting Mrs. Carnthwack, Madeline. I have told you so before. Less than ever now." "Why do you say less than ever now?" demanded Mrs. Betchcombe. "Are you blind, John Stedman? Or are you willfully deceiving yourself? Do you not know that that woman was telling lies? I can see, I should think anyone with sense could see, what happened that dreadful day in Luke's office. She took her jewels there, her husband followed her, I believe he is in it too. Probably he has lost his money. Americans are like that, up one day and down the next. He didn't want it to be known that his wife was selling her jewels. Yes. That is how it must have been. He sent her with the diamonds to Luke and followed her to get them back and make it look as if Luke had been robbed. Luke resisted and he was killed in the struggle. Oh yes. That was how it was. And this cock and bull story of theirs," she paused, literally for breath. Stedman looked pityingly at her wide, staring eyes, at her twitching mouth and the thin, nervous hands that never ceased clasping and unclasping themselves, working up and down. "Madeline, this suspicion of Mrs. Carnthwack is becoming a monomania with you. It is making you unjust and cruel," he said, then waited a minute while she apparently tried to gather strength to answer him. Then he went on, "There is not the slightest ground for this new idea. Cyril B. Carnthwack's name is one to conjure with in Wall Street as well as on the stock exchange here. Do you imagine that the police have neglected so very ordinary a precaution as an inquiry into his circumstances?" With a desperate struggle, Mrs. Betchcombe regained her power of speech. The police are fools," she cried passionately. "If a crime of this kind had been committed in Paris or New York, the murderer would have been discovered long ago, but in London, Scotland Yard cannot see what the merest tyro in such matters would recognize at once." "Do you think so?" John Stedman's clean-cut, humorous mouth relaxed into a faint half-smile. "I can tell you, Madeline, that both in New York and Paris it is recognized that our criminal investigation department is the finest in the world. But your feeling towards Mrs. Carnthwack is becoming an obsession. When the mystery surrounding Luke's death is cleared up, and somehow I do not think it will be long now before it is, I prophesy that you will repent your injustice. I prophesy that you will repent your folly in not listening to me, retorted Madeline Betchcombe obstinately. That woman was lying. Ah, you may not have thought so. It takes a woman to find a woman out. If I had my way, I would have women detectives. Do you suppose we haven't? John Stedman interposed gently. Dear Madeline, no stone is being left unturned in our endeavors to bring Luke's murderer to justice. Have patience a little longer. Patience, patience. I have no patience. Mrs. Betchcombe pushed Stedman's outstretched hand away wrathfully and turned to Mrs. Phillimore. Sadie, you thought the same, you said you did just now. In spite of her pallor, Stedman fancied that the butterfly looked considerably taken aback. I don't think I said quite that, she hesitated. I don't know what to think. I feel that I daren't think anything. What? Mrs. Betchcombe raised her hand. For one moment Stedman thought she was about to strike her guest, and with some instinct of protection he stepped to the butterfly's side. The butterfly visibly flinched. I think I said more than I ought, she acknowledged frankly. When you said she was telling lies, I didn't know what to say. What did you say? Stedman inquired quietly. Did you say anything that could be misinterpreted? The butterfly raised a fragment of cambric, widely edged with real lace. Apparently it did duty as a pocket handkerchief. She pressed it to her eyes, taking care, as Stedman noticed, not to touch her carefully penciled eyebrows. I said I didn't think Mrs. Carnthwack was telling us all she knew, she confessed. I cannot tell what made me feel that, but I did. She was keeping something back, I am sure, and her husband knew that she was. I wonder whether you are right, said John Stedman slowly. Chapter 16. I hear you are very busy, Aubrey, and I am very sorry to interrupt you. But I thought perhaps you would spare me a few minutes. The head of the confraternity of St. Philip was sitting at his writing table, apparently absorbed in some abstruse calculations. He looked up with a furrowed brow and without his usual smile as the rector of Wexbridge advanced into the room. I can't spare very long, Uncle James. This enforced absence of Hopkins is throwing double work on my shoulders. I know, assented Mr. Collier. You must realize how sincerely I sympathize with you, my dear Aubrey. But I bring some news that I feel sure will interest you. The police have found some of the emeralds. Is that so? There was no doubting the interest in Todmarsh's voice now. Where? And why only some? Why not all? He sprang up as he spoke and took up a position with his back to the fire, one elbow resting on the high wooden mantelpiece. My dear Uncle James, this is good news indeed. And I am sure we all need some. We do, assented Mr. Collier. As to your questions, my dear Aubrey, the police preserve a reticence that I find extremely trying. They have just told me that they have found them, not when or where. The only thing they will say is that they believe they were stolen by the Yellow Gang. It may retard developments to say much of their find now, they say. But how? Questioned Todmarsh. The rector shook his head. I don't know. I don't know how they can even be sure that the ones they have are my emeralds. They all look alike to me. However, they seem very certain. But what I came in for now, my dear Aubrey, is to ask if you can come to Scotland Yard with me. I don't see much good alone, and Anthony went away for the weekend last night. And I do know you would be more useful in identifying the jewels than he would. I wonder whether I could, debated Aubrey. Perhaps if we took a taxi and I came straight back. Stolen by the Yellow Gang, you say, Uncle James? Well, the police seem to think so, Mr. Collier assented. But I doubt it myself. What should the Yellow Gang be doing at quiet little Wexbridge? Aubrey smiled in a melancholy fashion that was strangely unlike his old bright look. The Yellow Gang infests the whole country. They brought off a big coup at a country house in the north of Scotland a week or two ago. That they should be able to do so and escape unpunished shows the absolute inefficiency of the police system. The Yellow Dog, as they call him, sets the whole authority of the country at defiance. Personally, I find myself up against him at every turn. How? The rector questioned. Why all this? Todmarsh made a comprehensive gesture with his arm that seemed to include not only the community house but the men playing squash rackets and cricket outside. All this is a direct challenge to the yellow dog. We get hold not only of those who have already gone astray, but of the potential young criminals who are his raw material, and do our best to turn them into decent members of society." Mr. Collier looked at him. "But do you mean that any of your community men were ever members of the Yellow Gang?" "Many of them, Hopkins himself, and at least 2 more of my best workers." "Then I should have thought it would have been a comparatively easy matter to get such information from them as would enable you to have broken up the Yellow Gang," argued Mr. Collier shrewdly. Todmarsh shook his head. "One would think so on the face of it. But, as a matter of fact, not one of them has ever seen the yellow dog. His instructions have always reached them in some mysterious fashion, and they have known nothing of the headquarters of the gang. We have never been able to get hold of anyone who knows anything of the inner workings." "Extraordinary," said the rector. "Still, I can't believe that they took my emeralds. With regard to your uncle Luke, it is a very different matter. What do you think?" "I have not had time to think lately," Aubrey Todmarsh said dully. "This terrible affair of Hopkins obsesses me, Uncle James. I cannot help thinking that I am responsible for the whole thing." The rector looked at him pityingly. "I know you do, my dear Aubrey. But you have described this idea of yours rightly when you call it an obsession. You are not struggling against it as you ought." "No. That is not quite what I mean. You can't struggle against an idea. What I mean is that you should try to realize, as your friends do, how very much you did for Hopkins, and how entirely blameless you are in the matter of his downfall." This was rather in the rector's best pulpit style, and the young head of the community house of St. Philip moved his shoulders restlessly. "You see, we don't look at the matter from the same standpoint, Uncle James. I do not acknowledge that Hopkins has fallen." Mr. Collier stared. "I don't understand you, my dear Aubrey." "No," said Todmarsh, speaking very rapidly. "I don't suppose you do. But I saw Hopkins yesterday and heard his story. It made me feel both thankful and ashamed," pausing to blow his nose vigorously. "Uncle James, when you know it, I am certain you will feel as I do, that it bears the stamp of truth. Hopkins has been working of late among some of the plague spots of the East End, and has been most marvelously successful. By some means he learned of the intended burglary at Wistone Hall, and also that one of the men engaged was one whom he had regarded as a most promising convert. He came to ask my advice, but I was out with Sadie and he couldn't reach me. I shall never cease to regret that I failed him then. In his anxiety to stop the plot, he could think of no better plan than going down to Wistone himself and reasoning with the men. Only in the event of their very obstinate refusal did he intend to give the alarm. However, when he reached the scene of action, he found that operations had begun sooner than he expected and that they had already effected an entrance. Hopkins went after them. He pleaded, he argued, and just as he thought he was on the point of success, he found that they were surrounded. Then, it is a moot point what he ought to have done. So conscious was he of his own integrity that the idea of making his escape never occurred to him, and when he found himself arrested with the others, he thought he only had to explain matters. His amazement when he was disbelieved was pathetic, so pathetic that I lost my own composure when listening to him. The rector raised his eyebrows. "But, my dear Aubrey, in the account in the papers it said that he was evidently the ringleader and that he was caught red-handed with a revolver in his possession." Aubrey cast a strange glance at his uncle from beneath his lowered eyelids. "The papers will say anything, Uncle James. Though as a matter of fact Hopkins had a revolver. He had just persuaded one of the more reckless men to give it up to him. Uncle James, in another minute Hopkins believes, and I believe he would have got them safely out of the house. He has wonderful powers of persuasion." Mr. Collier did not speak. Remembering Hopkins's gloomy countenance and pleasing habit of opening and shutting his mouth silently, he was inclined to think that Hopkins's powers of persuasion, if effective, must be little short of marvelous. His defense, too, did not strike him in the same light as it apparently did Aubrey. He was inclined to think it as lame a tale as he had ever heard. Presently Todmarsh resumed. "Keith and Swinnerton are taking up the case. They are the keenest solicitors I know, and they are briefing Arnold Winter for the defense. Oh, we shall get Hopkins off all right at the assizes. But it is the thought of what the poor old chap is going through now, locked up there alone and knowing how the world is misjudging him, that bowls me over." He stopped and blew his nose again. "But, my dear boy, you cannot be held responsible for that. And I am certain that nobody could have done more for him than you, if, as you say, he is to be defended by Arnold Winter. But I am afraid, my dear Aubrey, that it is likely to prove an expensive matter for you, for it is absurd to suppose that Hopkins I shall not allow Hopkins to pay a penny if it costs the last one I possess, Todmarsh interrupted, a dull shade of red streaking his sallow face as he spoke. You can have no idea what Hopkins was to me. To speak to a crowd of all sorts of men, and to have Hopkins sitting in the front with his wonderfully responsive face was like an inspiration. You who preach must know what I mean. Well, I hope you may soon have him back, the rector said slowly. Todmarsh smiled for the first time that day. Uncle James, I do not believe you appreciate my poor Hopkins any more than those people at Birchester do. Mr. Collier twisted himself about impatiently. I really did not know Hopkins at all, Aubrey. I did not take to him, I must confess. Birchester? I did not think that was the name of the place where he was taken. Oh, of course he was taken at Wistone. I suppose Birchester was the nearest jail, Aubrey said carelessly. Then with a little more appearance of interest, why do you know Birchester, Uncle James? Mr. Collier shook his head. No. My interest has always lain in the North or the Midlands. But Mr. Stedman has got Tony the offer of a post near there. He went down somewhere there the other day with Inspector Furnival. I thought them rather mysterious about it, I must say. I should have enjoyed the ride, for they went down in the car, and it was a lovely day. But I soon found that they did not want a companion. Business, perhaps, Todmarsh suggested. His face was dull and uninterested now. The enthusiasm so remarkable when he spoke of Hopkins had died out. Oh, I shouldn't think so. Mr. Collier dissented. What connection could there be between your Uncle Luke's death and a quiet little country town such as Birchester? No, Burford was the place they went to. Oh well, as we don't know who the murderer was, or where he came from, he may just as well have been connected with Burford as anywhere else. Uncle James, who do you think killed Uncle Luke? My dear boy. The sudden question seemed to embarrass the rector. He took off his pince-nez and rubbed them, replacing them with fingers that visibly trembled. How can we tell? How can any of us hazard an opinion? Heaven forbid that I should judge any man. The only idea I have formed on the subject can hardly be called original, since I know it is shared by your Aunt Madeline, who has been voicing it much more vehemently than I should ever do. Aunt Madeline. Todmarsh looked up quickly. What does she say? I have not seen her since the interrupted luncheon party. I have called, but she was out. But what can she know? She does not know anything, of course. The rector hesitated, his face looking troubled and disturbed. But like myself, dear Aubrey, she was listening very intently to Mrs. Carnthwack. I may say that my attention was fixed entirely on the lady, and it may be that my profession makes me particularly critical and observant. I dare say you have noticed that it does. Naturally. Todmarsh assented. But as he spoke the fingers of his right hand clenched themselves with a quick involuntary movement of impatience. Observant as Mr. Collier had just proclaimed himself to be, he did not notice how his nephew's fingers tightened until the knuckles shone white beneath the skin. Yes. We parsons so often have to form our own judgments on men and women quite independently of all external things, the Rev. James Collier prattled on, while only something in the restrained immobility of his nephew's attitude might have made a close observer guess at impatience resolutely held in check. Therefore, as I said, I watched Mrs. Carnthwack very closely, and I formed the opinion, the very strong opinion that though she was undoubtedly speaking the truth as far as she went, she was not telling us the whole truth. So far I agree with your Aunt Madeline. But I feel sure that, I will not say she recognized the murderer, the man who was impersonating your Uncle Luke, but I think that she saw something that might give us a clue to him, put the police on his track. And in fact I know that this opinion is that of Mr. Stedman, if not of the police. It is from Mrs. Carnthwack that the identification of the murderer will come, I feel sure. Still, I may be wrong. You, my dear boy. A sharp cry from Todmarsh interrupted him. The penknife with which he had been sharpening a pencil had slipped, inflicting for so slight a thing quite a deep gash in his wrist. The blood spurted out. His uncle looked at him aghast. My dear Aubrey, you must have cut an artery. What shall we do? A doctor. Todmarsh wrapped his handkerchief hurriedly round his wrist and tied it. He held one end out to the clergyman. Pull as tight as you can. I must have cut a vein. Excuse me, Uncle James. I will just get Johnson to make a tourniquet. He is as good as a doctor. I must apologize for making such a mess. If you will just have a look at the papers, you will find them over there, jerking his head in the direction of the table at which he had been writing when his uncle came in. "I won't be a minute, and then I shall be quite at your service." He hurried out of the room. Mr. Collier walked over to the writing table and took up a paper. But he was feeling too restless and excited to read. Events were moving too quickly for the rector of Wexbridge. Hitherto, except for his anxiety over Tony, his had been a calmly ordered life. Now, with his journey to London and subsequent discovery of the loss of the emeralds, he had been plunged into a veritable vortex of horror and bewilderment. Two things alone he held to through all: his faith in heaven and his faith in Tony. Whoever else might distrust Tony Collier and think that he had had far more opportunities than anyone else in the world of possessing himself of the emeralds, his father had never doubted him. He had seen a gleam of pity in the eyes of the detective who had brought him the news that the emeralds had been traced, which had told him who was suspected of having taken them. He was thinking of it now, and asking himself for the 100th time who the culprit could have been, as at last he seated himself in Todmarsh's chair and reached out for a paper which lay folded at the back of the inkstand. But he drew back with an exclamation of distaste. There was blood on the writing table, on the inkstand, on the cover of the blotting book. The first spurt from Aubrey's wrist had apparently gone right over them all. The orderly soul of the rector was revolted. He opened the blotting book and, tearing out a sheet, proceeded to mop up the blood. He tore up the blotting paper and took up each spot separately. But when the paper was finished, there were still spots of blood scattered over the writing table. Turning back to the blotting book, he tore out another sheet. "Wonderful," he said to himself. "It is wonderful that so slight a thing, a mere slip of the knife, should inflict so much damage. I should not have thought it possible." And as he voiced his thoughts, his long lean fingers were pulling out bits of pink blotting paper and dabbing them down on the drops of scarlet blood, then rolling them up into damp red pellets and dropping them into the waste paper basket. Then all at once a strange thing happened. As his fingers moved swiftly, mechanically over their work, his gaze went back to the open blotter. There on the leaf, as it had lain beneath the paper he had torn out, was a piece of paper. Just a very ordinary piece of paper with a few lines in a woman's clear writing scrawled across it. The Rev. James Collier read them over with no particular intention of doing so, then as his brain slowly took in the sense of what he read his fingers stopped working. He never knew how long he stood there, staring at that paper, while his lips moved noiselessly, while every drop of color drained slowly from his face and the stark horror in his eyes deepened. At last he moved. The bits of paper had dropped from his hands and lay in an untidy heap on the table. With a quick, furtive gesture he caught up the piece of paper, and moving quickly he thrust it between the bars of the grate into the sluggish fire inside. It burst into a flame and the rector stood there and watched it burn. When nothing was left but bits of grayish ash he turned away and put up his hands to his forehead. It was wet, great drops of sweat were rolling into his eyes. A few minutes later a messenger, one of the confraternity, coming down from the room of the head, found the Rev. James Collier letting himself out at the front door. "Mr. Todmarsh desired me to say, sir, that the cut is much deeper than he thought. We have sent for the doctor, and it may be some time before he is ready to come to you. But if you will wait, he will be very pleased." No, I won't wait," said the rector thickly, in tones that none of his parishioners would have recognized as his. My business is not important." A wild idea that of a certainty the clergyman had been drinking shot through the brain of Todmarsh's messenger, as he stood at the open door watching the tall, lean figure of the clergyman making its way along the pavement and saw it sway more than once from side to side.